Associate Director at the Center on Education and Work. On behalf of the Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to an afternoon policies and practice here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. An afternoon tea is also being sponsored by the Department of Counseling Psychology, as well as the Wisconsin Career Development Association. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Bown, professor at Loyola University Chicago at the School of Education. His topic today is Toward a Taxonomy on Career Decision-Making Difficulties. And a little introduction to Dr. Bown. He graduated from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1977. He taught at the University of Minnesota before moving to Loyola University Chicago in 1994. In recognition for his important scientific contribution, he received the John Holland Award from the Society of Counseling Psychology, and also this year, Best Science. His fourth edition of the Handbook of Counseling Psychology that he co-edits with Robert Lent continues to capture a wide range of topics and interests that represent the diverse field of counseling psychology. The handbook has served as a primer for generations of doctoral students preparing for the comprehensive doctoral exams in counseling psychology. I'm not sure what there's a few of them in the room today, so we'll see what their feelings are about the text. But for many of us, his most seminal research contribution to the field of career development and vocational research and theory is his co-authorship of the social cognitive career theory with Drs. Robert Lent and Gail Hackett. But I also wonder if he would rank among his greatest professional accomplishments the many doctoral students who have risen to great heights in our profession, including Karen Moulton, Karen O'Brien, Paul Gore, and the rising Matt Miller. He may or may not count as a contribution, we'll find out perhaps, that Dr. Bown is also responsible for my start in the field he gave me my first academic position. My best work was certainly due to his mentoring and patience during one of our many lunches where he had to explain over and over the difference between a mediator and a moderator. He also made it clear that my being hired at Loyola was conditional upon becoming a loyal Cubs fan. This, of course, is cause for ongoing pain and suffering for myself, my children, and at the rate the Cubs have performed this past century, the pain and suffering is likely to extend to my children's children. So, Steve, welcome to Afternoon Tea.
Thanks, Scott.
Now, our topic today is Toward a Taxonomy of Career Decision-Making Difficulties, but before we launch into that, just give us a sense. How did you become interested in career development theory and research?
How long a story do people want? Actually, I became interested in career development, vocational psychology research, kind of through the back door. My first job at Minnesota, I was hired, this is what I'm told, I was hired because I knew nothing about vocational psychology. I have never taken a graduate course in vocational psychology. Most of my research in graduate school and after that, in fact, I did a postdoc here in Madison in the psychiatry department way back when. But most of my research at the time was in coping skills training, relaxation training, and I was told that they hired me at Minnesota precisely because I wasn't a vocational psychologist. I was the only non-vocational psychologist on the faculty. But to make a long story short, Bob Lent arrived at the very same year at Minnesota that I arrived, and we, as two newbies, we started. And Bob, should I tell him Bob? I think Bob's had coursework and he had experience in career counseling, but his interest wasn't in career counseling either. But we started to get together because we were the newbies, and we were both interested when Albert Bandura published the first statement of social cognitive theory in 1977. Bob and I began talking about how can we do research on this theory, and it so happens that Nancy Betts and Gail Hackett published their 1981 classic paper where they translated at least the self-efficacy part of social cognitive theory into the career area. And Bob and I looked at that and said, well, Bandura essentially has four hypotheses about self-efficacy. Or we can translate four hypotheses: interest development, how choices are made, performance, and persistence. And we said Nancy and Gail focused on the interest and choice-making part. We should do persistence, and performance. And Bob happened to be teaching a career development class in the School of Science and Engineering. So we had a captive group of subjects. And so we decided, well, this career stuff might be somewhat interesting. We at least have a group of people we can start testing Bandura's theory. And that was our 84 paper, and before long we just got really interested in vocational psychology, career development. I moved to Loyola, and they said, well, you just came from the University of Minnesota, therefore you could definitely teach the vocational psych class. And I said, sure, I could do that. But it took, within 2 or 3 years after that initial study, I know I clearly identified myself as a vocational psychologist, so I started out being interested in social cognitive career theory, but the social importance of career development and its importance really got me interested in the topic, and now I consider myself pretty exclusively a vocational psychologist. That's what got me there, I guess. So it started out as a research interest that turned into a really strong professional interest.
Well, and you talked about the 84 piece, and probably those are the two, the 81 and the 84 piece, right, that are the two seminal things that kicked off the whole social cognitive movement.
Because we focused on performance and persistence. Gail and Nancy had focused on interest and choice. And,
right. Now, let's just keep talking then about the career stuff, and the topic today is on this taxonomy of career decision-making difficulties. And I was hoping maybe you could just, in a nutshell, kind of describe then what are the career decision-making difficulties as you're seeing it.
Yeah, can I talk a little bit briefly about methods too?
Sure.
Yeah. A lot of my research ideas come out of my teaching, and this interest came. So Bob and I still do a lot of research in social cognitive career theory, but we also have our own special interest. And in teaching I teach a career development course for master's students, and any doctoral student who comes in who didn't take it from me, they have to take it. But anyway, as part of teaching that course, I could teach theories. There was a lot to say. I found out I could teach about assessment. I could teach the research. I could teach a lot, but the outcome research on career interventions was abysmal, I thought. It was abysmal in a lot of ways. There was nothing I could teach about from the outcome research on career interventions.
Well, now let's just be clear. You're taking this as a scientist, looking for empirically supported interventions.
Right. So, and I thought it was weak in a number of ways. One, I'm going to get to it.
Okay.
One, I thought you looked at, and again, I'm not just saying what counselors are doing. As a practitioner, I was doing a lot of things that weren't showing up in the outcome literature. So the interventions tended to be very theoretically truncated. They seem to all be based on John Holland's theory, and John Holland has a wonderful theory, but there are a lot more theories that have empirical support, theory of work adjustment, that could have been incorporated, that I thought could have made career interventions more effective. Another piece was everybody, all the participants in the career intervention research seemed to be treated as if they all came in with the same problem. They were all treated identically. They had the same goal, that is to get more options. All the interventions seem to be designed around the idea that clients come in wanting more options. When in fact, I think we all know as practitioners that that's not the only reason clients come in with choice difficulties. Some people come in because they have too many options and they're confused because of too many. Other people come in because they're having a hard time deciding between a couple, or they're coming in because they've already decided and they need some confirmation. But everybody in the outcome literature seemed to be treated as if they had no options, and they wanted more. And then, I'm here. Yeah. Then the other piece was that everybody seemed to be treated as if they're coming in, as if the underlying reason for their difficulty was the same, despite the fact that there had been a lot of writing over the years suggesting that clients come in with different types of problems. And there had been a lot of research over the years looking at different correlates of indecision. And so what got me started, Nancy Ryan, so my interest became in how can we improve the effectiveness of career interventions and study it empirically. And so in 2000, Nancy Ryan Crane and I did a study looking at what goes on in career interventions and what needs to go on, what seems to be critical. So that was the first piece. Then we decided to turn to the question of trying to identify what some of the major sources of career choice difficulties are. And that's where this piece came from. And so what we ended up doing, and you read the paper, another thing I'm interested in is tackling a question whether there's a methodology there to tackle it or not, to come up with some innovative way to do it. But anyway, what we did was identified in the literature, there had been a lot of correlational research on sources of indecision. We identified about 28 correlation matrices in the literature. We factored those, and I can explain why we decided to do that, and then kind of meta-analytically combined the loadings. And what we came up with was 4 major factors that seemed to be overarching factors that's associated with career decision-making difficulties that seem to come out from these 28 different matrices. And here we are. Okay. And the 4 we came out with were somewhat not surprising because people had talked about them a lot, but there had never been any real empirical verification. One of the factors was what Paul Salmoni called chronic indecisiveness. And that was characterized, the variables that tended to load on that were things like the primary characteristic is as a long-term, chronic, overarching difficulty in making decisions of any type. So it's not just I'm having a problem with this career decision, but I have problems making decisions in all contexts. Other things associated with that was a dependent decision-making style. I tend to rely almost pathologically on others. I can't make a decision unless other people tell me what to do. A high anxiety proneness, external locus of control. And what was interesting, that chronic indecisiveness factor was almost, the characteristics were almost identical to what Paul Salmoni had described years and years ago. Second factor is a lack of information, self-occupational information. And what was interesting on that factor, too, was an approach conflict variable loaded on that factor, which I find interesting, which means approach conflict is you're kind of stuck between 2 good things. And I can't make a decision because both are equally positive. And one thing that says to me is a lot of people who are coming in or were coming in saying, I don't have enough information, or that seems to be the major problem, that may suggest to me that they're not looking for more options. They don't want that information in order to expand options the way at least the research literature thinks people behave, but rather they need information to choose between a couple of good options. Anyway, right. And then the third factor was interpersonal conflicts, external barriers. So variables that loaded on that is my family is pressing me to do something, I don't want to do it. I'm having conflict with significant others. External barriers, I don't have the resources to do what I want. That approach conflict variable loaded on that factor too. Again, suggesting to me people who are having interpersonal conflicts, again, may not be looking for more options, but rather that conflicts around 2 good options, or whatever. And then the final one we called, to be consistent with the literature, a lack of readiness. What did you Scott gave me another term I like better. Disengage. It was kind of a disengaged style, lack of readiness. Things that loaded on that were goal instability. People tended not to have very clear goals for themselves. Career decision-making, self-efficacy, didn't feel very efficacious in decision-making. Choice work importance, making a career choice now just ain't that important to me. Sorry. And belief in career myths, like there's one perfect career out there for me, and I can't find it. So essentially, those were I like Scott's term, disengagement, interpersonal conflicts, external barriers, lack of self and occupational information, and then this chronic indecisiveness factor. So
What I want to do is let's try to
shut up. No.
I just want to try to bring it down translate it down into more of a practice type
Right.
setting. So we've got four kinds of students. We've
Right.
got the student who's just anxious about deciding about anything. And when you say about anything, you're saying that they can't decide what to buy new toothpaste. They can't decide.
Or at least for hot decisions.
For big decisions.
Right.
So they have a hard time deciding.
Who to date or whatever. Right.
Okay. And then you have another, and I want to talk about that because you spoke to me earlier about that having some significant issues. That's
Right.
not something you grow out of.
Right.
And so we want to talk about that. The kinds of, I've got a couple of good things. I really need to know how to decide.
Right.
And how to, and you also mentioned with me before this about the idea of sometimes just needing confirmation.
Right.
And what that is.
Right.
And then we can get into the disengaged, and I think there's some interesting ideas about intervention about that student. It's just not seeing it as important. Why should I be interested? And then of course the interpersonal and just some of the challenges that are going on as well. So I'm in a school setting. We've got a number of school counselors that are working with middle and high school youth and are trying to get them focused on this. What are some things we can tell? Let's take that. What does a chronically undecided look like in a middle school type environment, for example?
So I guess I'm not sure what the person would look like in a middle school environment, but I can tell you I think we have some preliminary data that those potentially chronically indecisive kids exist in the middle school environment or the high school environment. As part of the study, that this part you didn't read about, there had been a lot of cluster analytic studies where a bunch of measures were given to people, and they looked to see whether they could cluster them into different types of clients. And we went back and looked at those cluster analytic studies using our 4 factors, see if we could reanalyze them. And what was interesting, there had been 2 cluster analytic studies done with one with 9th graders, one with 10th and 12th graders. And when we reanalyzed their data using our factors, both studies had identical percentages, 14% of the 9th graders, 10th graders, and 11th graders in the other studies that were showing, at least from our model, the characteristics of chronic indecisiveness. And I was surprised, only 2 studies, but 14% exactly in both studies.
So that tells us that there could very well be some students that are coming in and unless this is addressed, these have correlates with other mental health issues.
Right. And there are some data it's not from the chronic indecisiveness data, but a part of that is kind of a trait negative affectivity. And there are data to suggest from the personality psych literature that people who are chronically indecisive have this trait negative affectivity complex over time have their career development is probably going to be somewhat stymied. That is, people high on negative affectivity followed up in their 20s in some research tend to make less money than people who are lower. They tend to get fewer promotions than people who are lower on that variable and tend to be less satisfied with their work. So I think this chronic indecisiveness, negative affectivity, perhaps constellation, identified in 9th, 10th grade has some long-range consequences for kids' later employment, and that it's important, but I'm going to ask all of you, how do we intervene? It's important to be able to identify and intervene. And I'm not sure how to do that. One characteristic is a tendency to focus on what's going to go wrong, kind of a chronic tendency to focus on what's going to go wrong rather than right with a decision. So I'm trying to make a decision. I can't make it because all I can see is all the bad stuff that's going to happen. with any option I choose. So that says to me, perhaps if we can help kids to learn to focus, and I'm not sure how easy it will be, given this kind of trait characteristic that, but kids like that, if we help them focus on the positive aspect, and it may take some work to focus on positive aspects of decisions, it may take some anxiety management. All of this is speculation, and I bet the practitioners have seen these kids. Maybe you can give me some tips, because another aspect of the literature is that we know a lot in the literature now, I think, about working with a small subset of, empirically, I think we now know a lot about how to work with maybe 25% of the students we see, or maybe a bit more. One thing we don't know, because there's been absolutely no research done, is how do we work with the chronically indecisive, the people I'm calling chronically indecisive. People tell me send them out for psychotherapy, but no, we're doing career counseling with them, and we just don't know. And that any graduate student out here, you want a career of research that's going to have major impact, I would suggest starting to do some research on how do we intervene early with these 9th and 10th graders who are beginning to show signs of chronic indecisiveness. How do we treat people when they're out there after that for that problem? So, did that answer your question?
Well, it's getting there. I mean, that
okay.
You're on the, yeah. So that, two things on that. One is,
okay.
is we do have a significant issue.
Right.
I mean, 14%, and you add that in with other mental health issues,
right.
that's a serious
right.
issue.
Right.
But also, it seems to me that in middle and high school, it's possible, as you're indicating, maybe some of these interventions, they may be trait-like, but trying to work on it at 35 is a lot different.
Right.
You have a lot more history
Things are
behind that pattern
malleable.
of thinking.
Right.
So, so that's one thing to kind of alert to. And you also mentioned that there is a percentage that are going to do well with the career information and things like that, and also some of the relational piece. But let's just stay on the personality for a minute.
Okay.
We have a question that was brought in by Dave Wood. He's in Victoria, British Columbia.
Okay.
He's very interested in this whole Big 5 personality traits, and I know it's been hot in the literature.
Right.
How does that connect to what we're talking about? It feels like it does from the point of the decisive literature and things.
Right. I guess there are...
And maybe, and in doing that, maybe explain a little more what that negative affectivity is.
Okay.
Because that's kind of a weird construct.
Big 5? Yeah. There's been a lot of research in the personality literature to suggest that normal human personality could be pretty comprehensively understood in terms of 5 major traits. Okay. One is called neuroticism. It's not quite negative affectivity, neuroticism. Another is extroversion. Another is openness, openness to experience. Another is agreeableness and conscientiousness. Okay. Where do you want me to go?
I was just wondering, does this connect?
Yeah, what we found what we found in our studies is that neuroticism trait tended to load on the chronic indecisive. So it was a characteristic of chronic indecisiveness. What was in that conscientiousness is a trait characterized kind of at the high end by somebody who's persevering, goal-directed, organized, those types of things. And on the disengagement factor, chronic indecisiveness was negatively loaded on that. No, conscientiousness was negatively loaded on that. But in terms of, again, what the some of the implications there is going back to what I had talked about neuroticism, negative affectivity, although having long-range effects on people's job success, job satisfaction, those types of things.
Well, you've talked about...
I could go on and on about the Big 5. But
well, the key is that the answer is yes. These Big 5 do load differently across these dimensions, which is an important part of it. And
Scott and I think, have a disagreement. Well, the implications, I don't know. The data suggests that although they're somewhat malleable, by late mid-adolescence, these traits stabilize quite a bit. And that people don't change that. So the most extroverted person at 20 among his or her peers tends to be the most extroverted at 50 or 60. So they're pretty stable. I often ask, we talk about this in my career class, I often ask my students, if these things are so stable, why do we talk about them? Why do we talk? Because I'm not sure any form of career counseling definitely is not going to create major personality change.
See, now, of course, my challenge to that is an N of one experience,
Right.
where I started as an extrovert,
Right.
but after my doctoral comprehensive exams, I became introverted. So,
So-
but that's just,
but I
that's
guess
just my personal
right,
transformation.
Right, okay. And I started, yeah. I think we get more introverted with age.
Well, there we go.
Right.
Okay.
But one thing we do talk to students about is, even though these might not be changeable, especially in career counseling, they could give us some ideas for focus. So for instance, in terms of neuroticism, negative affectivity, a major characteristic is this tendency to focus on being stuck. Because my immediate reaction, if I'm high on that, is to focus on what's going to go wrong. What's going to go wrong with it, rather
And we
than
know that we have cognitive restructuring techniques
right,
that help
right,
address
right,
those
right,
issues.
right. That, and if I could just help people learn, I'm not going to change their personality.
Right.
But if I could help people learn how this personality characteristic affects my life.
Right.
And I can become aware of it and catch myself, for example, when I'm starting to focus on the negative aspects.
Then you can manage it better.
Then you can manage it, and you might not let it affect you as much.
Okay. Well, let me shift
I hope
topics a
that
little bit.
answered.
No,
What was his name?
This is good.
What-
Huh?
what
Oh,
was-
that was Dave Wood.
Dave, I hope
Dave
that.
Wood. Let me social cognitive career theory.
Right.
Did you ever think when you were putting this together that it was going to be as big as it became?
I guess we didn't. We thought it was pretty good. No.
Well,
No.
otherwise you wouldn't have done it.
Right. No. Yeah, we had hoped it would take off.
It was an explosion.
Yeah, it was, and we'd hoped to, and we tried to make it as testable as possible for people who wanted to do testing, do research on it, and we hoped. I thought we had. I think all three of us felt we had integrated things, and we pulled in things from outside of Bandura. Although Albert Bandura is wonderful. We would send him drafts of it, and he'd send us 3-page single-space letters back. And
So you had a pretty good idea you were on the track.
we were
when
on
he's
the
getting-
track.
When he's
We
giving you that
were
feedback.
on the track, and
Yeah.
we agreed. And some of the things we decided not to agree with him. But anyway, kind of bottom line is, we didn't expect it to take off as much as it did, but we're glad it did. I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Very glad it did, and there had been enough research on individual pieces, like self-efficacy. After Nancy and Gail's 81 paper, and maybe our 84, research on self-efficacy and career in the vocational psych just exploded.
Sure.
There had been a lot of research on goal mechanisms outside of our area, so we felt that most of the pieces had empirical support, and what our goal in doing it was. So the three of us sat down and said, there's been so much research on various aspects of the theory, we don't need to do another study. What somebody needs to do is try to pull it together. And it turned out that Bob had a sabbatical, and then after that, I had a sabbatical. So we had, and Gail had a sabbatical, and so we had a lot of time to try to do that type of integration that we thought it needed, and I'm happy it went where it went.
Yeah, and it's in, I mean, how many countries are people working on testing, and it's coming out across national
Right.
kinds of studies?
Right.
I wonder if anyone's done a count on the number of dissertations.
Yeah,
Hundreds, probably.
Right.
Hundreds.
Right.
Right.
Probably.
No, it's been amazing. Now, something that I find very interesting, and I don't know if anyone knows, you were at Minnesota, and you said you didn't go in as a vocational psychologist, but came out as one.
Right.
And the predominant theory of work adjustment, and it's kind of quiet in the literature, at least in
Always
ours.
has been.
Well, big in the IO,
IO.
industrial organizational, but not so much in counseling psych. Yet, reading between the lines of your work, and as I see the intervention and pieces going, it's a strong
Right.
theoretical frame. I just wonder if you wanted to comment on what you see as it bringing to even social cognitive theory, or just to your whole basis of your approach to career.
Yeah, we should have used the term. Yeah. I think, next to social cognitive theory, obviously, that TWA is one of the most empirically powerful. It's the most elegantly simple. I wish we could have been as simple. Most elegantly simple and powerful theory empirically that we have, I think. And it's not because I was brainwashed at Minnesota, but very simple, and so very simple, and it's used a lot. It's tested a lot in the IO, industrial organizational psych literature, not as much in counseling psych, vocational psych, career development. Very elegantly simple, a lot of support. That the correspondence between the vocational needs or values people have and the types of needs and values that are reinforced in the occupation predicts how satisfied one will be. Kind of the overall correlation, kind of a meta-analytic correlation there is about 0.51. Elegantly simple, the the correspondence between abilities and ability requirements predicts work satisfactoriness, how good a worker you'll be, very strongly. So we didn't use the terms, but if you look at our social cognitive career theory's performance model, we're talking about abilities plus self-efficacy essentially, without drawing all the areas equals performance. We don't use the term correspondence, but that's really, I think, what we're talking about. Ability requirement correspondence, a la TWA, then we add self-efficacy to it without drawing all the arrows.
But the values part, how is values getting into
Values,
social cognitive career?
values are incorporated as part of outcome expectations.
Okay.
So outcome expectations are the outcomes, what's going to happen if I choose this career versus self-efficacy, can I do what's necessary? And so a piece of outcome expectation is, are my values going to get reinforced in this occupation?
Okay.
And I think we say that in the 94 piece.
I don't
right.
know that it's measured as
No,
succinctly
no.
as you're describing it.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's
certainly
a
the
piece of
concept.
outcome. So outcome expectation, so values, kind of value reinforcer correspondence, perception of that is in outcome expectations. Ability requirement correspondence is in the performance model essentially. I hope Bob agrees with that if he's watching this.
Well, let me just say that then you would also say though that so you have your interest figured out, but getting to that choice, you know, and those intentions, the values play a stronger role.
Right.
Okay. In deciding that. I have a question from Aaron Karlstrom. Now this is out of Kansas. So we'll bring that in. We'll even go down to Kansas in this case, Kansas State. So I'm interested. I'm also thinking this going back to the practitioner, but also from the research piece. You looked at all these measures, right? How do we get into measuring this stuff? I don't want to have to go through 40 measures or 50 or whatever. I want to know what's a good way of looking at this taxonomy.
Well, if in a couple years, we're now developing a measure of the two factors. So maybe in a couple years you'll have something.
We'll have something.
But in the meantime, God, if I can remember, we also talked about this study in the 4th edition of the Handbook Counseling Psych chapter, and we gave some suggestions on some measures. There are several current measures, Judy Chartrand's Career Factors Inventory, Itamar Gotti's Career Decision Difficulties Questionnaire, and maybe one other that ask questions that are really faithful questions to the construct of indecisiveness. Simple questions about the chronicity and generality of decision-making problems. So, but 2 or 3 questions. So both of those instruments, and I think I would go, the CFI had the Chartrand's Career Factors Inventory has a measure of career indecisiveness directly. And then they also have measures of need for self and occupational information. So that one inventory provides measures of two of the things. And I think, so you may have to piece together. Gotti's Career Decision Difficulties Questionnaire has a measure of interpersonal
Okay.
conflicts and external barriers. So there's nothing there, but by pulling, don't tell publishers I'm telling you to do this, pulling out scales from different existing measures will provide pretty straightforward ways of measuring that. Is that what you're
We'll
asking?
be sure not to tell them.
Okay. Or buy them all and give, right.
Okay, and we're going to have some questions if anyone wants to come up to the microphone in just a moment. So please do come up. But I also want to ask one more question as we
Sure.
segue into
Yeah.
that. It has to do with you talked about it just briefly, but it's also a piece that I think from the interventionist perspective is probably as or more important
Right.
than even social cognitive career theory. And you and Nancy Ryan Crane put together a meta-analysis of what are the core intervention ingredients. What do we need to have in career curriculum
Okay.
to promote human development?
Okay.
And I find it incredibly useful, but I also find it easy to talk about, that people get their arms wrapped around. I was just wondering if you could just briefly, so we can get to some other questions, but talk about that and
Okay.
what you found, really.
Maybe you could if it's so, no. No, I mentioned this 2000, did I say, yeah, 2000, another meta, it was all, and again, it's all, both of these studies came out of my kind of dissatisfaction with what the career intervention literature was looking like and trying to improve the effectiveness of career interventions, at least those that were appearing in the literature. And Nancy Ryan Crane and I just wanted to look, number one, at kind of the current status of the literature, get an overall idea of how effective career interventions are for choice-making difficulties. And lo and behold, we found that they were somewhat effective, but in general, disappointing. And then we also wanted to see, is there anything that is done, are there any single things that might be done in an intervention that a counselor could do in an intervention that seems to be associated with increases in effect size, increases in improvement? And I won't get into all the methodology, but we essentially found what we called 5 critical ingredients. 5 critical ingredients that seem to be important, improve outcome over and above who the client was, over and above whether it was done in a group, it was done individually, it was a career class, over and above all these other things, format, who the client was, who the counselor was. And these were asking clients to develop and write goals that regardless of what else was going on in the intervention, those interventions that had clients develop goals for what they wanted to accomplish when counseling was over, and not only develop them, but write them down. We found goal setting by itself didn't contribute to effectiveness, but having the goals written did. So writing goals, probably writing goals for what you're going to do between sessions, writing goals for especially how you're going to use this stuff in the future. The other was giving individual attention, and a lot of to the written goals that people developed, and difficult to interpret assessment results, like inconsistent or flat profiles. Third was relying on or having people use models. A fourth was the use of career information. So as counselors, I don't know, I'm like this. I love to give assessment instruments and help people find out their interests, needs, and values. What we found that didn't add much. It's not that we shouldn't do it, but if it was done or wasn't done, it didn't matter. What mattered was things we don't find as interesting, and that at least I don't find as interesting, and that is getting people to use the information sources that are out there. And the more effective the interventions were in the research literature at getting clients to use and process the career information, the better they were. Not giving interest inventories, but using the information. And then finally, attending to the support the client has or their student has or could be developed for their choices. So there's been a lot of research looking at barriers to choices and supports for choices. What we found is that focusing on barriers, while important, didn't add, it's just like giving interest inventories. While important, didn't add anything to the effectiveness of the intervention. But attending to the types of supports a person might or might not have for the different choices he or she's thinking about, and then helping the client build in support when it was absent, added to the effectiveness. And what we found was that each one of these ingredients added to the effectiveness, and collectively they massively, so if you looked at interventions, did they use one of these, none of these, one of these, two of these, three of these? Unfortunately, none of them used all five. And it was amazing to see the almost linear increase in effectiveness as more of these critical ingredients, up to three, were added. So I'm sorry, I was pretty long-winded there.
That's awesome. That's what I was hoping you would say.
Okay.
So it's not just that you found the ingredients, but
Right.
you found in combination.
Right, right,
And it just seems to me that that also provides a way to analyze.
right,
What are we doing?
Right.
So if we're bringing in a guest speaker, could be a role model.
Right.
But how can we improve on that
Right,
effect?
right, right.
And we can improve on it by having other activities and
Right,
other things going on.
So I guess what I say to my students is that we know a lot about theories, and they're all important. You got to incorporate these theories, and there's things that we know we need to do, that we do, and it's not these critical ingredients. That it doesn't say these are only 5 things you need to do, but given what we do, if you add if one's adds these in critical ingredients, helps people set goals, make sure they use occupational information, attend to their supports, you can increase the effectiveness drastically.
Yeah, I also want to say that when you were talking about interpretive feedback, just giving an assessment and giving it to them
Right.
doesn't
No,
translate.
right.
It's the meaning that they gain out of
Right,
that.
right.
And sometimes it could be an interpersonal or
Right.
just some activity
Right.
that makes that a meaningful event.
Right.
The other thing that you mentioned, and I think it's so important because it links to the other areas of psychology, you talked about goals. And it's not getting and having talks about goals and aspirations. It's really identifying behavioral intentions.
Right, right.
What you're going to do with
Right.
this information,
And writing
what are
it
your
down.
next steps, and then having it articulated in writing. It has some,
Right,
it's amazing how that little shift
Right,
has such a powerful effect. And I think it tells us in a practice area, we can begin analyzing exactly
Right,
what we're doing.
right.
And even though you found that in the career literature, it seems like what you're focusing on
Right.
is key elements of
Right,
development,
right,
how we
right,
facilitate
right,
development.
right.
So,
For-
go ahead.
I just thought of something. He's supposed to be asking me questions.
That's right.
You are. I know everybody. A lot of people. I knew from your system. A lot of people do computer guided interventions, and from the meta-analyses, there are a couple of clear findings. That is completely self-directed computer guidance work. It's not very effective
On its own, right?
on its own. Some kind. The data. Part 2 is the literature suggests some type of counselor involvement in that process increases the effectiveness. I have no data on this, but my hypothesis is these 5 critical ingredients are what the counselor involvement in the computerized career interventions need to include.
Right.
Okay, you go through this, you help the people develop goals. Anyway, I said that. So in general, we know in the literature having some kind of counselor involvement with self-directed interventions improves the effectiveness. Anybody want to do a dissertation? I'm saying, I guess what I'm hypothesizing is that it's these 5 critical ingredients. That's what the counselor involvement should involve.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it adds the human element in. So
Yeah.
it gets to the creating a meaningful experience is what jump starts the whole piece.
Right.
And so whether it's a teacher that's engaged in it, a counselor, whoever it is, there's some dynamic
Right.
taking place with the information.
And I'm saying those 5 things
those
is what
5 are the
creates-
core,
right,
things that we focus on. Yeah,
right.
and that's why I think it's such a powerful
Yeah.
piece to
Okay.
really map that out. We have time for some questions. I don't see anyone at the microphone, so we need to have someone come up and ask a question if they would like. Ask one. This is David Callum from Center on Education and Work. David?
Yeah, you were just asking or talking about the incremental effects of these different treatments. And the question came to my mind was, when you're talking about, and I'm not that good of a researcher to have an answer to this, so When you're talking about an incremental benefit, so this is better, this plus this
Right.
gets better and
Right.
better. Is that because can you tease out whether that's because the treatment is more
Or is it
effective
more?
for an individual, or more effective because it's simply given to a bunch of different individuals who needed those different treatments? In other words, if you had these 5 interventions
Right.
and could target them to the person that needed them,
Right.
would that not be a better effect than having all
Just
of
for-
the treatments being given across
Right.
all of the people in order to get this quote-unquote
Yeah.
incremental benefit?
Excellent question. I can't give you an answer. So I guess if you could target to what people need. So somebody who needs more information, if you targeted that way, is that what if the person didn't need I would guess, but I guess my answer is that's an interesting empirical question, because what we did, where we came up with them, we took existing research, okay, and meta-analyzed the existing research, and then after we had identified the 5 critical ingredients, we went back to the studies and said, did this one use any of the critical ingredients? No, so that got put in the 0 category. Did this study use any? Yeah, that one used 1. So then, and we looked at the outcome, the effect size, averaged over those studies that used none, those that used 1, those that used 2, and that's where we got the linear relationship. I tell you one thing I'm pretty sure about is that it's not just doing more things. So you do just. If I do more stuff, I'm going to be more effective. In a 2003 paper, there were other ingredients that we looked at that didn't come out critical, and we randomly generated different combinations of those ingredients, went back to the studies and said, what studies use these 3 randomly generated agreements, what used 2, and we didn't get the linear relationship. We only got it when these specific ingredients were added together. But I'm all for targeting interventions to people's problems, obviously from this second study we did, and that's a wonderful suggestion. Targeting these ingredients at the individual level for people who need it. Although, I'm sorry, I'm free associating. I think goal setting
is important across.
Attending to, at least paying attention to, looking at, analyzing, helping the kids figure out, do they have support for this option or this option, and if they don't, how can I build more support? So at least analyzing for the support. If the kid doesn't need more support, then it's already there, but having that be part of the choice-making process is there support for this option, and how do I deal with it if I don't have support for it? So some of them, I guess, I'm thinking now as I'm free associating.
Is it possible that what we're talking about when we're talking about a particular subgroup, the content may shift? So if we're working with chronically undecided, it may be a different content.
Right.
But what you've identified are process elements that will improve the effectiveness of that content as it gets delivered.
Exactly, right.
So it really is, you really are looking at it more from what are the processes.
Yeah, I guess we are, yeah.
So it may not be world of work information, but it's information about chronically undecided that could be about anxiety.
No, I think whether you're chronically indecisive or just needing information, that you're going to work differently with these 2 groups of clients, but including these 5 ingredients in the treatment or the counseling with whatever you're doing with either group
We'll
is going
improve
to improve
That's
it,
the
I
idea.
think.
And that would be great.
Right.
Next question, Bruce Wampold.
Good. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Bruce.
So this goes back 30 years because I asked you the same question in a class I took from you on decision making.
Yeah, he was a graduate student when go ahead.
Okay. So now we're going way back. You've been waiting 30 years.
I've been
now.
waiting 30 years. So the question then was in decision making, because it was presented as a very cognitive activity. I develop the advantages and the disadvantages of various choices,
Right.
and then I make that decision. And the question was around where does emotion come into this?
Right.
And since that time, we have a lot of research in a lot of different areas
Mm-hmm.
that really says the emotional content,
Right.
the affect, is what drives decisions.
Right.
And not the cognitive rationalizations. So for an example, in voting behavior, Drew Weston at the Emory University looks at how people
Right.
make decisions about who to vote for. They have an affective reaction to
Right.
candidates.
Right.
But then if you ask them, they come up with this elaborate rationalization.
Right.
They have experiments in moral decision-making and so forth, and they can induce different kinds of decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and people afterwards come up with rationalizations that had nothing to do
Right.
with their actual decision. So in this model and in your talk, I don't see much reference to affect, and what role does affect play in vocational decision-making and in the interventions that we give both kind of the general programs as well as the individualized counseling.
Probably not as much as it should, but I'll answer you. I was a very strict behaviorist when Bruce was a graduate student, and if he asked, my answer was probably emotions.
Yeah.
They don't play. You know,
We
it's
can
all
we can
behavior.
reinforce
We can
those.
reinforce those things. But now, answering it all these years later, emotion, I'm sure, plays a big part in career decisions, but we don't attend to it enough. I agree 100% with
Now,
you.
you mentioned values, though. Doesn't
Yeah.
that have an affective
I guess
base
it
to
has an affective base to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that these, you know, like the basic dimensions. I don't know who's watching this because I somewhat hesitated when I equated neuroticism with negative affectivity. They're not the same thing. But human emotional experiences, Alki Tellegen,'s research has suggested, can be described on two basic dimensions: positive affectivity, negative affectivity. And I think the negative affectivity piece has been studied pretty wide, has been acknowledged in the career literature in terms of how it, as we've talked about, leads to difficulties in making decisions, being stuck, unable to make a decision, its long-range effect on later employment outcomes.
So you have
PA
an emotion base to that.
Yeah, there's a PA has in our Bruce. I'm getting in the factor analyses we did for this study I was talking about today. We could only we could only include factors that we could get replicated across similar measures, and there were some other factors out there. One was a more positive emotion factor, but every study that where we identified that used a different measure. So we couldn't, I don't know how I can, so how we identified common factors, we identified a factor, then we looked at the variables that loaded on that, looked across other factors and said, do the similar variables load on that? Yes. And then what variables load along with that one? Does this make sense? And then we moved across there. We couldn't find any common variables in this positive factor, so we didn't include it. But there was a clear negative affectivity piece in what we called indecisiveness. There, we picked up from the research that there was probably what I would call a positive affectivity piece, but we couldn't verify it. Does that answer your question? It's more than I gave you when you're a graduate student.
Concrete. So you
Right.
take the career indecision.
Right.
And somebody who can't make a decision, and you ask them, well, why not? And they
No.
list all the things that can go wrong.
Right.
Which is the rationalization
Right.
for their indecision.
Right.
When in fact it just may be anxiety.
Anxiety, they're afraid.
And the anxiety is the affective part.
Right.
So there's a avoidance of this through
Right.
a affective process.
Right.
And that's ignored when we start to
Yep.
list out, here's the reasons why I
Right,
didn't want to do this and I
right,
want
right.
to do that, which are rationalizations,
Right.
so I don't have to kind of
Right.
admit this is really just
Right.
an affective reaction.
Yeah. In trait anxiety, was the primary marker
Yep.
in our factor analysis. Trait anxiety, if you ranked by factor loading, trait anxiety was the primary marker of indecisiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
See? Huh? Yeah.
Okay, I'm Lee Nelson,
Hi,
and
Lee.
I'm coming not as a scholar in the career area, although I'm sort of becoming one lately. I'm coming as a former career counselor, did it for about 13 years, and at community college level. And one of there were two practices that seemed to be the most powerful in my work with clients. One was this old inventory that we don't use anymore because it was normed in 1953, called the Edwards Personal Preference Schedule.
Right, right.
And I found that extremely useful because it addressed Murray's taxonomy of needs.
Right.
And I got to talk to clients about needs that were absolutely conflicted. And working around that conflict, I have a high need for nurturance, but I also have a high need for succorance.
Right. Right.
And, you know, how do I balance that out?
Right.
That was one. And then the other was, we used the California Occupational Preference System. I don't know if you remember that, but it had an interest inventory, a values inventory, and an abilities inventory.
Self-rated abilities or
well,
actual ability
it was
tests?
like a little teeny IQ test.
Okay.
And I'll tell you, that was the most powerful of all three of those instruments. It was, people in community college who had not a lot of self-efficacy would take that and walk out starry-eyed because they hadn't had it gets into that support thing. Oh my gosh, I'm smarter than I thought I was. Oh my gosh.
Right.
That's all I have to say.
No
good.
question?
No question.
Okay.
I just, if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah. Yeah, nobody uses. Does anybody use the Edwards Personal Preference Schedule anymore? But
You
but
can't.
but
It's
value
not
value
normal.
need conflict, I think
Personality
is
rating form.
right,
It's the same
right,
thing.
right. Understanding values and understanding maybe the conflict among values or understanding how values play into the decision-making process, I think is really important. And I talk about the MIQ, we use the Minnesota Importance for to get at values. Never even thought, thank you. I'm going to bring Edwards back into my classes because we talk about the importance of value assessment, but I don't teach or ever mention the Edwards.
I think the PRF gets the same thing.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think
But
we are-
but the kids got higher G scores than they anticipated, and that was extremely motivating. Intelligent, yeah.
That's great. All right. Well, this has been an afternoon tea with the Center on Education at Work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Visit our website at cew.wisc.edu to find out about our annual careers conference, our online career information system, the WISC Careers and Career Locker, as well as our other professional development opportunities related to translating career and workforce policy into practice. Information on how to view our afternoon tea conversations along with the readings for each session will be available on our website as we get closer to our next conversations. I want to thank Jennifer Lindwall for her invaluable help in helping us coordinate this, and Ivy Brown and Anthony Hernandez for their graphics support. Also, thank you to the Pyle Center for helping with the recording of this presentation, our conversation, and also our co-sponsors, Department of Counseling Psychology and the Wisconsin Career Development Association. So on behalf of the staff at the Center on Education at Work, I want to express our thanks to Dr. Stephen Brown for your insights and such an engaging conversation today. So thank you.